most of us struggle to handle difficult conversations. Let's visualize a few scenarios. You're in a movie theater. The people next to you are chatting somewhat loudly. You wait for a few minutes, you hope that they'll quieten down, but they don't. So you request them to tone it down. They comply, but a few minutes later, they're back at it again. You're mildly irritated. You again wait a couple of minutes hoping that they'll quieten down, but they don't. So you request them once again, maybe not so politely this time, and a few minutes later, they're back at it again. What would you do? Let's talk about another situation, a more involving one. A young man and a woman are looking to get married and start a life together. But somewhere, the woman senses something that makes her slightly uncomfortable. There seem to be differences in, values, in attitudes towards money, in life goals, and so on. But she hesitates to bring this up because she doesn't want to dampen the moment. She doesn't want to dampen the exuberance. So this stays in her mind. It gnaws away at her and potentially ends up undermining the relationship. Let's take another example from a work context. An employee who's hardworking, conscientious, but somewhat reticent. And he sees his flashier peers walk away with the promotions and the bonuses, and he wonders whether he needs to bring this up with his boss. But his boss is someone who, values loyalty a lot and doesn't take criticism or questioning too well. So the employee worries that he may be seen as too pushy or too aggressive, and he chooses to not bring it up. But again, this festers in his mind and lowers his motivation. And over time, it actually potentially ends up affecting his productivity as well. So over the last 25 years, in my various roles as a business leader, as an investor, as a leadership coach, and even as an author, I've noticed that one of the main ingredients of being able to be successful is the ability to navigate difficult conversations. Let's say there's a company, you're a startup founder, you get an investor, a venture capitalist to invest in your company. It's not uncommon, it's actually very common for founders and investors to have differences of opinion about how the company should be run. Should we, hire aggressively, expand, scale up, which means we'll burn a lot of cash? Or should we bootstrap, try and conserve capital, but then you might end up sacrificing growth? Founders and investors who have this conversation upfront are more likely to succeed, and those who don't are most likely to end up in court. In my journey as an author as well, it's very common for an author to have differences of opinion with the editor, creative differences. Now, what happens when such differences of opinion surface? Do you, as an author, clam up and refuse to budge? Or do you end up yielding and kowtowing to the editor and agreeing to everything she says because, you don't want to lose the publishing deal? Or is there a better way to handle this? Almost all of us, when we are faced with a difficult situation, exhibit one of four responses. Either we flee, or we freeze, or we fight, or we fawn. What does this mean? Flee. Basically, we try to avoid or run away from the situation. We are hoping that the situation won't come back to us. So think of an employee, he quits a job because he has a difficult boss. He joins a new company, once again he has a difficult boss. So the problem doesn't really go away. Sometimes we freeze, which means we are paralyzed and we do nothing. We try to brush the matter under the carpet, only for it to resurface again, because it doesn't get brushed under the carpet. Sometimes we fight, but many times we do this in a way that's not very constructive. We end up being hurtful, we end up being accusatory, we end up saying things in a manner that becomes a blame game, or we have an emotional outburst and it's just messy all around. Sometimes we fawn, which means that we are so worried about upsetting the other person that we end up trying to please them. But in the process, we end up bottling up resentment. Is there a better way to handle difficult conversations? For many years, I actually wondered whether there was a holy grail, a superpower, which would enable each one of us to handle difficult conversations well. Because there are some people who actually manage to ace these conversations. Is it a natural trait, or is it something that we can cultivate? Over the years, as I progressed in my mindfulness journey, I was able to look into myself and understand what are the triggers, what are the emotional responses that happen when faced with a difficult situation. In my journey as a leadership coach as well, I had the opportunity to understand how other people respond to difficult situations, sometimes constructively, sometimes not so constructively. And I began to get a whiff of what this holy grail, the superpower, is all about. So the catch is that most of the time we end up looking at the external world for an answer. We try to, and the internet is full of these sorts of advice. We try to look for hacks, tactics to influence the other person. But actually the answer is to be found within us, because it's our inner reality that creates our outer reality. The famous poet and mystic Sant Kabir Das has said, "Ichha kaya, ichha maya, ichha jag upjaya," which means your inner reality creates your body, your inner reality shapes your perception, and your inner reality creates the world. And a couple of the earlier speakers mentioned this as well. You become what you want to become. So you need to have this difficult conversation with yourself first. That's the holy grail, the superpower. So what does this mean? What is this difficult conversation you need to have with yourself? Think of your personality as an iceberg. There are some parts which are of that iceberg which are above the water, which is your knowledge, your skills, your area of expertise, and so on. But there are some parts which are below the iceberg. Things like your values, your belief system, your deeper motives, your self-image. And it's these parts of the iceberg which are below the water that make difficult situations difficult. Let's take an example. An employee who is not able to say no to work, and he ends up feeling resentful, overworked, burnt out, taken for granted. Not uncommon, right? We all see this in our offices. He may be having, it's not the only explanation, but he may be having this need for approval. This in turn might be a result of childhood experiences where love was conditional. So the way that he found to get acceptance and love was to please others. Not surprisingly, he doesn't want to rock the boat, so he's not able to say no to work. Another example, an employee who is reluctant to bring the issue of a pay raise with his boss. Again, one of many possible explanations, he might be having a poor perception of his self-worth. So when he's ending up being paid less by the organization, he tends to rationalize it. Oh, maybe we are going through difficult times, maybe XYZ, rather than question his own perception of his self-worth. Among the other things which are in this part below the iceberg are also our fears, like the fear of rejection. Now, this is a primeval fear because we are all wired to be part of a herd because it keeps us safe. And the fear of rejection means that we are fearing being alone. So in a personal relationship, either in a romantic relationship or in a friendship, one hesitates to bring up difficult issues because we are afraid of being left alone. In the investments world for many years, as an analyst, as an investor, I would see that people would find it very comforting to just follow the herd. Because if you take a contrarian stance, you're going to have a difficult conversation with your board or your investment committee, and we try to avoid that. And yet, being able to transcend this fear of rejection is a superpower. Many authors, most authors actually, including J.K. Rowling, have faced rejection multiple times. In my leadership coaching career, some of the most successful salespeople that I've come across are those who've been able to handle rejection in their stride. So being able to get over this fear of rejection is a superpower. Also, the fear of failure. We are all brought up to shun failure. And we live in a culture all over the world that praises and glorifies outward indicators of success. Not surprisingly, when we come across a difficult situation where bringing it up might lead us to lose a business deal or lose a job or maybe lose a relationship, we prefer to shy away and just brush the issue under the carpet. And yet, as Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, eloquently put it, the greatest success comes from the freedom to fail. What are the other things that could be below this iceberg, which are part of this difficult conversation that you need to have with yourself? It could be, potentially attitudes towards authority. Our relationship with authority is a complex one. It's influenced by the culture that we are brought up in. So a senior leader who might otherwise be a great performer may hesitate to disagree with a CEO even when the issue is an important one, because he's been brought up in a culture that frowns upon disagreeing with people in authority. We also, many of us, have various beliefs around using power or authority. We think it's immoral. But there are situations when you need to do that. If you're a leader of a team and one of the team members, despite repeated warnings, is doing something that vitiates the atmosphere, lowers the morale, you would need to take command, assert your authority. But you often see leaders who hesitate to do that. They instead opt for some sort of a workaround, some sort of via media ad hoc fix to the situation, which doesn't address the deeper issue. So these are the various areas which are in the lower part of this iceberg. Need for approval, fear of authority, fear of failure, fear of rejection, attitude towards power, self-worth, etc., etc. So these are all part of this difficult conversation that you need to have first with yourself, because our inner reality creates our outer reality. So, this is a theme that we see in literature as well. There's this external journey that the character goes through in both my books, Kalkut and Agniban, because I love travel. There is a lot of stuff that happens in the external world, an external journey, external conflict, etc., etc. But the real turning point in both the books, and actually in most books that you will read, comes when the character goes through an internal arc, an internal inflection point. And when the character goes through this internal reckoning and comes face to face with his or her demons, that's really the turning point of the story. So we're back to the same thing, which is have this difficult conversation with yourself first. But how do we go about this? Ye sab theory to theek hai. How do we implement this in practice? 4 steps. The first 2 are internal. The third and fourth have to do with how you engage externally. The first step is awareness. Be aware of your iceberg. When you encounter a difficult situation, be aware of what raw nerves it touches, what fears it kindles, and how it impinges on your values and your beliefs. That's the first step, awareness. The next step is acceptance. And this is a difficult one. Accept the situation in its entirety. Accept the difficult feelings that it might bring up. It could bring up feelings of helplessness because you feel you're not able to do anything about it. It could bring panic. It could bring anger, rage, fear, and a whole bunch of other emotions. Don't judge them. Accept them. Once you're able to do this, then you're in a position to have this difficult conversation in the outside world. So the third step is to try and see what's the common ground or what are the common rules of engagement. Even when 2 people are seemingly completely at loggerheads, there's usually a baseline that you can start from. If you're the product and the sales department in a company, or 2 departments in a university which have a difference of opinion, the common thread, for instance, in a company would be that you will still both decide to do whatever is in the customer's best interest, or you would decide to do whatever it is that is going to further the organization's vision. That's your common ground, your baseline. As an author, when I have creative differences with my editor, the common baseline is we will both do whatever is in the best interest of the book. So what that does is that it tunes out things like ego and you said this, I said this, and instead the focus is on how can we achieve the best outcome. In personal relationships as well, like a friendship, right? The common baseline is there are some common values that both of you adhere to. That's your common ground. Even in situations like, employee misconduct in a company or something, the common baseline is the codes of conduct or the rules or policies of the organization. So try to find that common ground so that provides a starting point for you. And the fourth point is that bring it up in a way that is constructive. Now, this is a tricky one because many of us, when we are having a difficult conversation, often either, seek some sort of vengeance or, humiliation, or you want to get back at the person. It becomes an ego thing. Instead, the focus should be on being transparent and being constructive. Now, this doesn't mean that you kowtow to what the other person says. It doesn't mean that you give up on your interest. What it instead means is that you have empathy, so you understand where the other person is coming from, and that's actually your best shot at getting the best outcome. Now, one last thing, which is critical to being able to handle difficult conversations, is to know that sometimes, despite your best efforts, the outcome will not be what you wanted it to be, because there are some factors which are genuinely outside of your control. But there is one factor which is squarely in your control, and it's the most important factor, and that's your mindset and your attitude. And so the next time you're faced with a difficult conversation in the outside world, have that difficult conversation with yourself first. And remember that it's darkest before dawn. On the other side of a difficult conversation, a treasure trove of fulfillment and growth awaits you. Thank you.